This is lecture 2 in chapter 14 on plants, and we're picking up with our first plant group. So this is the plant group that is most closely related to the ancestral protist that would have come out of the water. And this is the non-vascular plant group. So these are mosses and other non-vascular plants. The big thing with this group is that they don't have a vascular system. So they don't have any vessels, any plant equivalent arteries and veins to transport any of their nutrients and water from either the leaf areas. They don't really look so much like leaves when you look at moss, but that's what they are, to the other sections of the plant. So who are the non-vascular plants? So the most of the non-vascular plants, you can see the large number of species are going to be mosses. And you're familiar with these guys. You're going to find them growing under, big trees in the forest and under rocks and things like that, along rivers and streams. We also have hornworts, which these guys look like kind of fuzzy. There are also spiky versions of these where they're just individual spikes. And then we've got liverworts, which liverworts come in lots of different forms. This one's actually in its reproductive stage. Most liverworts just look like big flat sheets. You can see that there's quite a few species of liverworts, very few species of hornworts. So what do these guys have in common? They're small. So the largest mosses are a couple of inches, and that's it. They don't get any taller than that. The same is true for liverworts and hornworts. And this is because they have to distribute their water and nutrients through diffusion. So if you remember when we talked about transporting materials in cells before, we had our cell membrane, and diffusion was moving material from high concentration to low concentration. And that diffusion is a slow process. And that's what these guys are going to use. They're going to use diffusion, they're going to use osmosis for their water, but it's going to take time if they want to move from cell to cell. And that's going to take a lot of time. And so being small will allow them to be able to transport from one end of the plant to the other and not take really, really huge amounts of time. We're going to take a look at how they reproduce. So they're going to use spores, which is something that we don't see in some of the other plants that we'll see later. And those actually are going to grow to produce the plants that make the gametes. The other big thing is they have a life cycle with 2 phases. They have a phase that is haploid, and they have a phase that is diploid. So remember, haploid means that they have 1 copy of the chromosomes. We shorthand that as 1N. And diploid means that they have 2 copies of their chromosomes. So we'll see that there's actually 2 separate life phases for these guys. So there it is, all written out in bigger words, so you can pause that if you like. So they are going to move their water and nutrients via diffusion. They've got those haploid spores. Oh, and that's the other thing. We'll see this in one of the pictures. Their haploid spores are moved by wind. That's important. We'll see that when we get to some of the other plant groups. They're going to use other methods to move their parts around. And then, as I mentioned, we've got those diploid, haploid life stages. So what are we looking at? So let me get my face off of the picture. So here's a moss life cycle. So the part of the moss that you're used to looking at is this part right here. So this is the fuzzy moss part that you're used to seeing. If you look over here, you can see the fuzzy moss down at the bottom, and that's the spongy, squishy part. That's the haploid stage. So this part only has 1 copy of the chromosomes. And so what they're going to do is they are actually going to create the sperm and the eggs. So these guys are going to do mitosis. and create sperm and eggs. It's weird. Plants are weird compared to animals because remember, we make our sperm and eggs through meiosis. And so the plants are going to turn it around and do it a little differently. So they're going to do mitosis because they're haploid. They just have to make copies of their cells to make their sperm and eggs. And then if you look up here, you should notice that the sperm have tails. And so they have tails because they are going to swim. And so mosses require rainfall. They require water in order to reproduce because they need that water for the sperm to be able to swim to the egg to fertilize. Once that happens, then we get the diploid stage, and that's going to turn into an embryo, and that's going to create this odd looking structure, at least to us. This is the diploid stage of the moss. And so if you've ever seen moss that have these structures sticking up out of them in the woods, these are the diploid part of the moss. In this section, they're going to do meiosis, as you can see here. That's going to create the spores. So these little guys have little caps. When they're ready, the caps fall off and the spores are going to get blown out. And this is how mosses get moved around. We talked about earlier that one of the problems with being sessile, with being stuck in one place, is that it's hard to get your offspring to move. And this is how mosses do that. They are going to actually use the wind to move the spores, and lucky spores that land in the right place will grow into the haploid moss and start the whole process over again. So you can see we've got that diploids, or the haploid stage, the diploid stage. Very different kind of setup than what we're used to seeing and thinking of when we think of something like an animal. So why are mosses important? Well, for us, they're actually economically important because they are actually useful for heat. So what you're seeing here, this is an old peat bog. Peat is actually a type of moss, sphagnum moss, and so what can be done is you actually see them where they've been cutting bricks, and the bricks are stacked and allowed to dry out. And then they can be burned as fuel, just like we burn logs here. The other thing that they use peat for is they burn it in stoves for specifically making whiskey. And that's actually what causes that smoky flavor in Scotch whiskey. So that's why Scotch has a specific taste to it compared to other types of whiskeys like bourbon and so forth. And sometimes people might say that Scotch smells kind of like a campfire, and that's actually why, because they actually burn it over a peat fire. So we have economic uses for it. Also, we use it in gardening. If you've ever used sphagnum moss as part of your soil mix, that's what this is. It's part of this peat. Mosses are also important out in nature as part of the soil. So what you're seeing here is a tree who's having a very bad day. So over time, what has happened is the soil has eroded out of underneath of the tree. The thing is that around the base of trees, you will commonly see moss, and it's beneficial for the moss because the tree is going to be shading them. It's going to keep them moist and wet, but it's also beneficial for the tree because those mosses are going to keep the soil from eroding from around the base of the tree and washing that dirt away. And so it's going to keep the dirt around the tree and keep this sort of thing from happening. Now, this is a very drastic version of it, but even trees like, trees on campus or around your house, without mosses or some other plant growing up near their root system can actually lose their soil, and the roots can be exposed, and that can cause them various problems as far as diseases and so forth. Oop, sorry about that. We can't use clickers of any sort, so skip right through that. So those are the non-vascular plants. No transport system in those plants. The rest of the plants in the groups have vascular tissue. That's actually what made large plants possible. So again, the mosses, the hornworts, the liverworts, all only about 2 inches tall. All of the rest of our plants can grow very large, and this is why. So these vascular tissues allow the efficient transport of water, nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, and food from photosynthesis to move over long distances. So you can see I mentioned they look like veins and arteries. They even have them colored like veins and arteries if you see human diagrams. And so one set of these is going to travel from the shoots to the roots, and the other set's going to travel the other direction from the roots to the shoots. And they actually even branch off into the different leaves and branches as they go up and down. So the first group that got these were the vascular seedless plants. So vascular because they have the vascular system, and seedless because obviously they don't have seeds. So they are going to use this vascular system. Who are we talking about? We're talking about ferns. Now you might be looking at this and going, that's not a fern. There are tropical ferns that actually grow into trees. So there are tree ferns. Most of the ferns that we're used to seeing are ferns like this if you've gone hiking in the woods here in the northern United States. And then there's also a very small group of what's called horsetails. The genus is Equisetum. If you squint at it, kind of, maybe they look like horsetails. These are usually found in wet type areas like wet woods and things like that. So the characteristics for vascular seedless plants, like I said, they're ferns and horsetails. They have that vascular system, but they don't have seeds. So they're like the mosses and hornworts and liverworts in that they're going to create haploid spores that are again going to be blown around by the wind to get moved. And then they also, like the mosses and other non-vascular plants, have a haploid and diploid phase to their life cycle. Unlike the mosses, what we're going to see is that these two parts of their life cycle are going to look very, very different from each other and look like they're almost separated from each other. So let's take a look at what ferns look like. So we're looking at the fern life cycle. The same is true for horsetails. They just don't look like ferns, they look like horsetails. So here is the diploid part of the fern that we're used to seeing. So you can see they've got a picture over here. Here's our little cartoon guy. Oh, sorry. So we've got our diploid fern, and that fern is going to create the spores. And that's what you're seeing over in this picture here. These brown dots are the spore producing sections of the fern. And so those spores will get produced and released. The wind is going to blow them around. Again, the ones that get lucky and land in the right place are going to grow into a haploid fern, and that's what this little guy here is. So this little haploid fern is going to produce eggs on one section and sperm on the other. And if you look closely again, we've got sperm with tails. So again, we're going to need water. So after things like a rainfall, we're going to have those sperm swim over to the egg and fertilize the egg. Once that happens, we get an embryo. This haploid fern version breaks down as the embryo grows into the diploid fern and starts the whole process over again. Most people never notice the haploid ferns because they are quite small. And they are usually found again in wet type areas. You don't find ferns in drier areas because they need that water in order to reproduce. So